This is some of the outlines of the Antrim Coast Road are already known. I knew that there's a lot more to be discovered, and I had material from mint books and other sources produced by the Office of Public Works back in the 1830s. However, it turned out to be very difficult to piece it all together. I got a vast number of small little bits. And I have to say, what I've got ready right now is more an assemblage. I can talk about aspects of the Antrim Coast Road rather than a coherent picture of how it was built. A little bit less than I expected and hoped, but there is some fascinating new material. And I think I've solved certain things that were a bit uncertain. So you'll see from the little handout, you know I've got the handout. In fact, well, now there may be a couple of people who haven't got a handout, and I can get a handout for you afterwards. That shows, it's got a very crude map of the road itself with the key areas, the key points on the road that turn up again and again during construction. And it's also got a table just showing the labour and service costs every fortnight from 1832 to 1835. Towards the end of 1834 and into 1835, that gets a little bit more patchy. So I've kind of made estimates to see exactly what was going on there, judging from other evidence. I can tell when they were working and when they weren't working. So I'll go into that when the time comes. Okay, well, William Bald. This is a piddock, Folus dactylus.
Can you use the microphone, please?
Thank you. Well, it's a, all right, okay. Can you move a little bit closer? Can everybody else hear me? It's a little bit hard to, okay, anyway, it doesn't matter. Can everyone hear me like I'm talking now? All right, okay. It's a shellfish which was a favourite of William Bald's, and it was something that he pondered quite a bit and he used in engineering. Engineers at the time he was one of the last of the big generation of, you could say, non-university trained engineers. And I think there's significant differences between those kind of engineers and the later engineers. In a way, the period from about the 1780s to the 1840s was you might call the heroic age of engineering. Engineers were very big figures. William Bald himself was a very well-known, very highly regarded man at the time. He knew nearly all the major engineers of the period, but paradoxically, we don't have or strangely, we don't have any image of him. He's, in some ways, there's a lot that's still unknown about Bald. Now, I just had that shellfish there just as a point of, to stimulate interest, to start it off. But I'm going to move away from it right now. Now, Bald was born in Burnt Island in Fife. That's basically across the water, on the Firth of Forth, across the water from Edinburgh. Bald is a fairly common surname. Initially when I set out looking at this, I thought I could maybe track down something more about his family, but it's a pretty common surname in the kind of Glasgow-Edinburgh corridor. So there's quite a few families. It's very difficult to know, to kind of track down very much more right now. There is an assumption that he was related to Robert Bald, the mining engineer, and that he was the first cousin of Robert Bald, whose father was Alexander Bald, who was also a mining engineer, who was a colliery manager and mining engineer for the Earl of Mar in Alloa, which is kind of northwest of Edinburgh. Alloa, Edinburgh, and Culross, which is another area for the Balds, and Burnt Island were all basically on the Firth of Forth. Now, we know that his mother was Grisel Bell, but we don't know his father's name. So it's one of many things that we don't know about Bald. We know that he was probably he wasn't Church of Scotland, he was probably an anti-burgher seceder, so a different branch of Presbyterian, and he would have had a basic education in Burnt Island, and at the age of 12 he went over to Edinburgh. He had 2 more years of education when he was taken on as an apprentice with John Ainsley, one of the leading cartographers and surveyors of the period. Ainsley, the fact that he was put on, again, the fact that he actually managed to get an apprenticeship with Ainsley suggests that he had contacts. My guess is that the assumption, the hypothesis that he was connected to Robert Bald is correct. And it was through those contacts that he got the apprenticeship. Now, at that stage, he probably would have left school in our terms at 13 or 14. And then he was plunged into an apprenticeship. We tend to have a false idea of the simplicity of, you could say, pre-university education. I remember looking at primary school education in the 1840s, 1850s and 1860s, and looking at the sort of exams that people did when they finished school at 13 and 14, and they were extraordinarily difficult. In fact, the quality of education was very high, and I'd expect him to have been very well educated even by the time he began his apprenticeship. But apprenticeship was much more than, I suppose, the idea, as university has taken over, a theoretical education at university. Civil engineers were educated at university from the 1830s in England and from the 1850s in Ireland. As that kind of approach took over, the idea of apprenticeship, in a sense, became seen as a more rudimentary thing, or just a severely practical thing without theory. But in reality, these apprenticeships engineers and apprentices gained very developed theoretical understanding. This is just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea. Ainsley, who was his master, and with whom he got on very, very well, and through whom he made connections with a whole network of engineers and surveyors. He brought out the classic work on land surveying in 1812, a treatise on land surveying, and this is just the contents page. So you can you get a sense of the scope that he would be expected to do. And this would be the sort of stuff this came out in 1812, and he was an apprentice with him in 1806, 1807, 1808. These are some of the geometrical exercises. It was pretty serious stuff, and you'd have to take it seriously. When you look at Bald's later writings, it's obvious that he was well aware of, he could read French and German, and he was well aware of all the technical literature being produced around Europe at the time. So the fact that he was apprenticed rather than university trained doesn't indicate that he had a rudimentary education. Now, I suppose one of the basic things that he began initially was surveying. And he was known as a surveyor and cartographer for about 20 years before he began to develop a reputation as a civil engineer. Again, first of all, the engineers kind of moved by practical work into their profession, but they actually would have had a pretty good theoretical background. That's the first thing. This is the pre-university age. They would have had, they basically learned how to build bridges by building bridges, and using the theoretical stuff that they had absorbed, but constantly practicing as well as absorbing theoretical stuff. This was a nice little illustration in the Ainsley book, and it was something that he started off all his apprentices on. It's basically measuring by chains, using the Gunter's chains, and this was the basic thing that Bald would have begun with. Now, the theodolite would have been in extensive use in Scotland and in Britain from the 1780s, 1790s. and that was a lot more sophisticated. When Bold came to Ireland, he discovered that a lot of the surveyors weren't using theodolites, particularly in the western regions. But this was one of the theodolites that he would have been trained to use. Now, the very first, actually I'll just go back because that's a little bit distracting. After 2 years apprenticeship, Bold was sent by his master to do a vast deal of surveying up in the Hebrides for several of the larger landowners. So he was only about 16 when he started that. So obviously Ainsley had great confidence in his powers at that stage. It was strictly speaking, it was surveying, cartography that he was doing. He did apparently, in about 3 years, he did about 300,000 acres. So he worked in the Hebrides and then he worked elsewhere in the Highlands. So it was an immensely impressive achievement for somebody that age. Now, he became known at some time in early 1809, he was introduced to Dennis Brown, the MP for Mayo, down in London while he was at London attending Parliament. He was introduced by members of the Ordnance Survey, the British Ordnance Survey. He would have known the staff of the Ordnance Survey quite well because Ainsley constantly worked with them and had actually worked for 20 years with the British Ordnance Survey. They introduced him to Brown, and Brown was probably attracted by his experience of this kind of, the Highland mapping, because it loosely resembled the kind of mapping you'd expect to find with enormous areas of poor land that you'd expect to find in the west of Ireland. And he just offered him the job of creating a county map for Mayo. County maps had been produced. It was one of the last of the county maps. It wasn't the last one, but one of the last of the county maps. They had been produced in Ireland from about the 1780s. One of the rationalisations, as it often is for these kind of big projects, was that there was a kind of a military rationalisation, and because Mayo had been invaded in 1798 by a French expeditionary force, it was assumed that that Mayo needed a very good county map. So he arrived over to Castlebar in 1809, shortly after getting married, and set up home in Castlebar and started to create a series of baselines for the county map. The deal was that he'd get about £2,000 and that it would take 5 to 6 years. That's what he was expected to do. But he was pulled aside after about 4 months and asked Dennis Brown and John Foster and a few of a closely knit group in the British Parliament set up a commission to survey bogs at almost exactly the same time. And they were so keen to have Bold on board that they made a deal that he would work 1 month on, 1 month off on the Bogs Commission for basically the next 3 years. And this is the area that Bold was assigned for the Bogs Commission work. He did that work extremely thoroughly, and it assisted in the creation of the county map in the end. Now, he got back to the county map full-time about at the middle of 1813, and he completed it in 1816. This is a nice little illustration from it. He's regarded as one of the ablest of the cartographers working in Ireland at the time. If you remember, he was really only in his early 20s at this stage, and he had covered one of the largest counties in Ireland in great detail. He was more interested in topography than in parish boundaries and those kind of administrative aspects of cartography. It's one of the last examples of that sort of beautiful hashering to give a very strong three-dimensional sense to a map. This is just a little excerpt just to show you the kind of the map. This is an area that I know well myself because my mother comes from this place here. It's Curran and Achill Island Sound and Acklebeg. And among many other things, you can recognise a lot of place names, and it's one of the earliest sources for place names in Mayo at the time. So you get a very detailed, an amazingly detailed breakdown. The scale was 5 inches to a mile, which was amazingly ambitious at the time. One of the as he did the maps, he created very sizable models of every part of Mayo. And one of the models, he did a model of Achill Island. Now these have been lost, unfortunately, but they kind of were incredibly impressive things at the time. It gave me a very clear sense of the physical structure of the areas. Now, in 1815 the map was brought. He managed to bring, the map was a huge thing, and he managed to bring it over to London to display shortly before he was completed. It was regarded as a very beautiful map of Mayo. It occupied a square of about 18 feet square, so that tells you, would that be the size of this room? It's not quite the size of this room, obviously, but about 2/3 the size of this room, something like that. I'm not sure if that's a rough estimate. And the mountains, hills, rising grounds, bogs were distinguished with judgment and delicacy. The elevation of the mountains, hills and passes were also laid down, and a section of the whole country from west to east illustrated its geological structure. It excelled anything of the kind which I have seen, and was executed by Mr. William Bald. He worked with several other assistants at the time, including Patrick Knight, who later produced a tremendous study of Eris. It was also meant to be accompanied, the map was meant to be accompanied with a memoir of Mayo, detailing what was going on in every district. Unfortunately, that remained in manuscript, it wasn't published, and it's now lost. The original manuscripts, there are only, the full-size map doesn't seem to be in existence now. There's just pieces of the map in existence, and there's engraved versions. But it was brought to France in the mid-1820s, and was regarded as one of the sort of wonders of the cartographic world at the time. He was lauded very highly for the work. Now, it was one of the last of its kind, because the Ordnance Survey began in the late 1820s, early 1830s, and took on a different kind of measurement and approach to cartography. So he had hoped that the combination of modelling and his kind of highly physical cartography would be extended, but in fact he turned out to be one of the last of a particular kind of cartographer. This is a letter to Annesley in Castlewellan in 1819. The County Down Grand Jury was extremely interested in the map and considered for 6 months whether to do the same thing in County Down. He just mentions that he has the model, and he just looks for his expenses. He attended the assizes in Downpatrick, and he explained exactly what he could do. Or he quite generously said he would explain to, if anybody else wanted to do it, or if they wanted to hire somebody else, he would give consultancy advice on how to do it. They never took him up on the project, but it was interesting to see that they were thinking about it. It took from between 1819 and 1829, the map was engraved. Now, it took an enormous amount of time, mainly because there was a series of engravers who took it on and then fell into difficulties. So it was really a series of blows of bad luck that meant that the engraving of the map was delayed considerably. So during the 1820s, in the early 1820s, he supplemented his work with work on harbours and bridges in the west of Ireland. He did a report on Cork Harbour. But I can't find that he did a great deal of engineering work in the later 1820s. Now, he was over in Paris and I know he was active in France during the 1830s and 1840s, and he produced papers in French, but I haven't got any information as yet as to any works that he may have been involved in France, except I know he was involved in extending the channel of the Seine at one point. So by the 1820s, he was known essentially as a cartographer, and he had a sideline in engineering. So at the same time, he had an amazing reputation, and he seems to have been virtually all the major engineers seem to have deferred to him. And engineers at the time were quite a peremptory bunch. They were basically the elite, the technological elite of the day. And they tended to, when you actually look at, say, if you look at any particular project, you tend to find that there's always a number of engineers involved advising on how a bridge should be built, or a harbour devised, and that sort of thing. And they all tended to be quite quarrelsome and to oppose each other's designs very emotionally and passionately. Bald didn't seem to get that kind of treatment as much as others. Now at this stage, so he was basically known as a cartographer, and yet he was taken on when the Board of Works was founded as a consultant engineer. And I can't quite understand how he kind of entered the Board of Works at such a high level and was treated with such deference given his limited engineering background at that stage. So there's a kind of a puzzle in there. Now this is John Fox Burgoyne, who was the first chairman of the Board of Works. He had fought in the Napoleonic Wars, in the Peninsular War, and he was essentially a mining engineer. His expertise was in explosives, and in sieges. His knowledge at that stage was a little bit old-fashioned, but he picked up what was necessary fairly quickly. He was again in some ways his personality was a little bit similar to Bald's, in that he was highly respected and he seemed to get on with people very well. He didn't seem to fire into the kind of controversies that were very common at the time when you look at these big projects. He was appointed chairman to the Board of Works, the Irish Board of Works, in mid-1831. The Act of the Board of Works was promulgated in September 1831, and the point of the Board of Works was to finance and to also to closely monitor, and where necessary for the government to actually build all the major public works that appeared necessary for the development of the country. That's in broad terms. Burgoyne had quite a sympathetic attitude towards Ireland, and towards the poor in Ireland. He wasn't he didn't have a sort of a disdainful attitude of Irish work methods or Irish expertise. In any case, Bald was hired as a consultant and was very active from September 1831. We find him. He was called upon to design the Agivy Bridge on the Bann, and this is just a little illustration of that bridge. It's Bald's drawing. A wooden bridge across the Bann, which was the grand juries of Antrim and Down had required a replacement for that bridge, and through the Board of Works they got the facility of both a grant and loan finance to produce it, and Bald was immediately called upon to do that. This is another one. It's a nice thing, just showing the timber structure of the Agivy Bridge. It's one of Bald's drawings again. He was also called upon to look into various proposals to enlarge the channels and build docks in Belfast to improve Belfast Harbour at the time. Now, like a lot of engineers, he devised his own, while he did a report, he devised his own version, and this was one of his versions that he devised. It didn't go ahead directly, although it did go into later developments. You can see over here on the right-hand side, he was also called upon to do a report on a proposed railway from Cave Hill to Belfast Harbour. A company was setting up a railway, and they were looking for finance from the Board of Works to begin an export of limestone from Cave Hill. He was very favourable towards the project, but for various reasons they didn't think the company itself had the capacity to deal with the loan finance necessary. Now, Ball was also called upon to report on roads in 5 Mile Town to Clonus and various other roads in the Midlands and in the West. And so he was in constant activity really in the north of Ireland, 1831 and 1832, 33, 34. But in the big project that he became known for, really, after the Mayo map, was, of course, the Antrim Coast Road. Now, you could say that roads as kind of the kind of monumental road schemes were one of the big agents of they were almost like new industrial communications all over the British Isles from the 1780s to the 1830s. The leading idea of the time was to centralise the communication system. Broadly speaking, up until the late 18th century, most roads were either very local roads or they were lengthy turnpikes monitored by turnpike trusts. The road system, in fact, now with the development of a lobby for the centralisation of roads in the early 1800s, there was a kind of a very critical campaign against turnpikes and against local roads, and an assertion that there could be no prosperity without good roads, without sort of vastly improved road system. But the vastly improved road system was going to be extremely expensive as well. And it's from the 1790s, early 1800s that Telford and McAdam develop the kind of standard sort of engineering report that you begin to see very commonly in the 19th century, quantifying costs, distances, and the likely benefits of these kind of large projects. You could say the government was, for about 30-40 years, the government as a whole was quite open to the donation of public money towards these projects, and these were vast sums of public money. When I kind of look at it myself now, I'm kind of reminded of like vast IT projects. In some ways, the engineering at the time, civil engineering in particular, was like, they were almost like IT experts nowadays, and there was an assumption that communications themselves would in some way produce vast beneficial changes. Now, I'm not opposed to the communications things, but they didn't necessarily produce the kind of changes that were argued on their behalf. And the government was willing to pour vast sums of money into these communications schemes as well. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because the quality of the road system before the 1820s, and of course, well, the other thing I've got to mention is that, and again, it's a very similar, you can see analogies in the present day, but Scotland and Ireland were peripheral to the Industrial Revolution in Britain, and the powers that be in Scotland and also in Ireland, really essentially the landowners, were very keen for these, for communications to be vastly improved. Something like the putting in motorways nowadays, on the assumption that it was only through these linkages that the industrialisation, that in some way industrial activity would spread all over the British Isles. Now there were other factors involved, and it didn't happen in that sense. In the case of Antrim, the Earl of Antrim was aware that there was iron deposits and other mineral deposits in Antrim, and he had the assumption that if he built an excellent road through his estates, that this would also enhance this would kind of energize, generate mining activity and kind of entrepreneurial activity, and ultimately bring him higher rents. I mean, that's what it was really about. Now, behind all this, I just want to say that the road system in the 1820s and 1830s was actually quite a good road system. It wasn't a bad road system. And the deficiencies were greatly exaggerated. This, in a sense, it raises questions about it. The Antrim Coastal Road was an amazing achievement, but I have to say, when I look at it kind of objectively, there are questions about whether it was really necessary or how much economically it achieved for the actual expenditure. In the mid to late 1820s, the grand jury was very keen on a coastal road, and their initial idea was to just enhance the old road. And they hired John Fulton, a surveyor, to devise a scheme to improve the old road. The costing of that scheme came to about 17,000. Now, it was ready and was examined by the grand jury in 1829, 1830, but there was rumours at the time that the Board of Works would be founded and there would be loan facilities available. So they just held off on investing in this road, which would be funded by local tax, just to see what they could actually achieve what they could get from the Board of Works. Now, this is Fred Hammond gave me this. I assume this is around Larne, the Larne district, and this is one of the old roads. And it doesn't look, they weren't actually quite bad, they were quite level and quite straight. This is, you can see there's quite a few roads on the go in the kind of in upper Glenarm, which is kind of the lower part of, or the southern part of the area of the Antrim Coast Road. And that's an example of one of them. And there's the Ordnance Survey and memoirists and others, Du Bourdieu in 1812, have quite considerable praise for them. They do say that they're a little bit hilly in places, but they say they're quite well repaired and the bridges are quite good. They're not too bad. Now they do deteriorate. It's less extensive, obviously, towards the north of Antrim. And this is an example up on Garran Point. You can kind of see where one of the old roads was really little more than a track. So certainly the road system at the north of Antrim was poorer. Now, the Fulton Plan, which was developed for the grand jury about 1829, 1830, they proposed that to the Board of Works in late 1831, early 1832. The Board of Works looked at it, and got Bald to look at it, and Bald decided that it could be greatly improved. And he proposed a much more adventurous plan, but the plan was going to cost about 10 grand more. Fulton's plan was about 17,000, and Bald's plan was for about 26,000. And in fact, that was probably an underestimate. The Board of Works was fully behind Bald, partly because I think they just loved the idea of the sort of scheme that Bald proposed, because whereas you'll see in a minute from the charts, obviously the old road was inland and Bald's road was literally along the coast, all the way up to Cushendall, apart from a couple of miles. And it was proposed in a very ingenious way. He was going to blow up the rocks, create a bed for the road, and create a surface for the road where there was no surface at that point, and use all the raised beaches, fossil beaches that existed all along the coast. Now, the grand jury they were quite dubious. And they, mainly because they felt they would have to pay for most of this. Ultimately, the Board of Works kept increasing the size of grant that they were willing to pay. And ended up offering about £9,000 and reducing the terms, or improving the terms of the loan. So the interest rate was lower and the length of time that they had to pay it back was lower. So Burgoyne was extremely intrigued and attracted by Bald's scheme. Bald, they kind of argued that Fulton had underestimated his costs, but of course Bald actually underestimated his costs. Now, all the ins and outs of the deal were arranged in August and September 1832, and that's when the grand jury finally agreed to go with the Bald scheme. And Bald was appointed on the 27th of September 1832. Now, I have a nice, this is, I've got his letter of appointment, 27th of September. At the time he was working on the Drogheda Harbour and he was given a couple of weeks to finish that up. He had already done a report on the Antrim Coast Road, but now he had to do a more detailed version. It's worth just read out a bit of it there just to kind of give you a sense. I'm directed to request that you will proceed to lay out the coast road in the county of Antrim from Larne to Ballycastle with a view to its being commenced without delay. The board has appointed Mr. Thomas to be the resident engineer. Let's see now. You were given the necessary instructions previous to your lock splitting the line over the Kerry Mountains, which is to be let to contractors. It's recommended that the measures for draining the extensive sliding banks at the south end of the promontory should be attended to early, as well as a practical passage for persons on foot made completely around. With reference to the passage over the Kerry Mountain, you are requested in the first instance to ascertain the precise difference of level between your proposed road on the elevator bridge over the Cushendun River and that of the left bank on the spot to which Mr. Fulton has proposed to cross the same river, in order to know what may be the saving of the long rise of the mountain by your project. You'll endeavour to lay out your line of road up the south side of the mountain as nearly as to a slope of 1 to 22, or somewhat easier as the ground will permit, avoiding at the same time to traverse to any great extent the steep rocky cliffs that are found on that side. Now, they start off with the Kerry Mountain. He starts off with the Kerry Mountain aspect. They have decided to break up the project into 4 different parts. I think they had a fair idea that they had underestimated the cost, and that in some ways the best way of doing it, and in a sense of getting the job done without drawing too much attention to the problems, was to actually break it down, to actually assign Bald to do the most difficult parts and let the rest of it be done afterwards. When you couldn't really do anything else. Once these 4 parts were done, you really had to finish off the road in any case. So you can see from the map, I've got a sort of the map will give you, that you're holding, gives you a quick, you may know these things already. I've been looking these up myself, but you can see the 4 key areas that were done. Was the Kerry Mountain area in between Cushendall and Ballyboy in North Antrim, and also there's a lake there, Lochivina, which had to be dealt with. Clooney Point, which is near Glenarm, which is just north of Glenarm, where there were banks of sliding blue clay, lias clay, and great risk of mudslides at that point. And Little Deer Park, which had extremely difficult limestone cliffs in horizontal strata. And I'm going to show you some of those. The rest of the coast road was also done along cliffs and was done in small stages, and that's really like the 4th part. That was a constantly moving point of construction. In overall terms, well, actually, I'll go into this in a minute. He had to, in the lock splitting that Bald was advised to do. Locksplitting is an archaic term, and it just indicates setting out trenches to show exactly the line of a road. At that stage, it's really only in October, November and December 1832 that Bald really set out the plan in detail. And that's when he actually produced the plans that I'm going to show you in a minute. You can see from the table that what I did was I looked at if you look at the table, you can see the late 1832 and early 1833. You can kind of work out, these are very crude figures, but I could see the labour costs, and I could see also there's other costs there, the purchase of tools and things like that. But those labour costs, I can kind of break down from the average price of labour per day. I broke down estimates for the number of labourers being employed at that stage. And at that stage, for the first 4 or 5 months, you had an average of, it started off at about 15 or 20, but it went up to 50 or 60 labourers. And mostly those were engaged in assisting in laying out the road. That's what was really happening at that stage. The serious work on the road really didn't begin until March, April 1833. And it's understandable too, because obviously this was over the winter period, so you couldn't do the sort of work that, you couldn't work on the Kieran Mountain at that stage in the same way. So you had to wait until things dried up in the summer of 1833. At the moment, I'm using this kind of table, the table, to sort of indicate a chronology of the works. You can kind of see how, you can kind of get a rough idea, although it's kind of disguised. He was working on the Kerry Mountain, but you get a rough idea of where people were working from the expenditure in the different parts. And from the size of expenditure, you can see the number of labourers being hired. Now, they mentioned to Bald that in ordinary cases the road is to be 30 feet wide between fences, and under circumstances that seem to require a reduction it might be 21 feet, and for short distances and very difficult passages to save considerable expense it can go down to 16 feet. The stoning is to be 16 feet throughout, except in the neighbourhood of towns where it should be 18 feet. So there's a very detailed set of specifications given in that. Now, he couldn't do it on his own. And his principal ally, the resident engineer, Bald for most of the period from the first part of the road, the Board of Works part of the road, was finished by the end of 1835. It starts effectively at the start of 1833, or the end of 1832, and finishes about October 1835. There's a complete hiatus for about a year and a half, and then Charles Lanyon begins the second part of the Antrim Coast Road, where he fills in all the gaps, and he does the easy bits, you could say, as well as the Glendon Viaduct and some other areas. And essentially that hiatus existed because the grand jury was bargaining for an increased grant and for even more favourable terms on a government loan. Now, Bald, for most of the Board of Works period, for the 3 years that the road was being constructed, was engaged in all sorts of other activities as well. He was working down in Clonus, and he was also involved in the construction of a very big road, which had, for instance, a 600 feet tunnel on it, on the road from Kinmare to Glengarriff. So he was flying all over the country at this stage. His resident engineer, now he was back and forward to the Antrim Coast Road quite a lot, and Burgoyne visited the road quite a lot as well. But his resident engineer was first of all a fellow called Richard Thomas. Now initially I thought there's quite a well-known English engineer, Richard Thomas, but in fact it turns out that Richard Thomas had been working in Kingstown Harbour in Dunleary for the previous 12 years. And he was nominated by the Board of Works for his expertise in explosives, in the use of explosives. And also because it solved a personal problem that he had, because the Border Works took over. The commissioners of Kingstown Harbour had been building a very large harbour there from about 1816, but the Border Works took over that harbour in early 1832, and they started reducing the staff and slowing down the construction works temporarily. Richard Thomas was working there for £230 a year. He was offered a reduction of £30. He rejected it, and in the end they bargained with him and they offered him the Coast Road instead, because in fact the next Border Works offer was actually temporary suspension of duties. So he took up the Border Works, or he took up the Antrim Coast project for £150 a year, and he was quite disgruntled. And eventually, after a year, he went back to Dunleary, where he worked as a consulting engineer for the Border Works for a short while before going back into full-time activity in Dunleary Harbour. But he was a very experienced guy, particularly with explosives. There's quite a detailed, in his memoranda, there's quite detailed instructions as to how the men should be managed. Burgoyne insists that only very able-bodied men should be employed on the coastal works, although he concedes that less able-bodied men and also boys could be employed on the Kerry Mountain bog works. Thomas was to be resident in Glenarm at all time and to give fortnightly progress reports on the construction of the site. I haven't come across those reports as yet. They would be gold dust. Because then you could really build up a clear chronology. The assumption initially was that Ball's initial idea was you could just use the rocks of the cliff to create the road. And there was obviously going to be a fair bit of blasting involved, but the initial assumption was that you could do at least half the destruction. They reckoned that limestone was relatively soft and you could use wedges and crowbars and mauls to break up the limestone boulders. This turned out to be a little bit optimistic in the end. Now, they were very keen as well that there was all kinds of instructions about how they were to be paid. Public works employment had a very bad reputation. People were paid, there was delays in payments, and also both in public works employment and in all large projects, there was a serious problem with truck payment, where in essence people were paid in kind. They were directed to get their necessities and provisions from certain shops, and these provisions, the cost of these provisions was taken off the nominal cost of their wages. So it was very important to the Border Works that everybody was paid in cash, and individually paid in cash, and paid every single month, every fortnight. Now this had problems, and it didn't work as well as people hoped. But all these instructions were given to Richard Thomas because he was going to be the one supervising the men at close hand. The ideal, Richard Thomas found in the end that the best way to handle the works was to have small gangs of 10 to 15 men with one man of superior skill overlooking them, and there would be an overseer at about £30 to £40 a year at every site. The Border Works weren't really happy with that, and there were constant tensions between the Border Works and Thomas and the later engineer John Geeky, because they believed that it would be superior to have larger gangs of people. But they didn't really, I don't think they realised what was going on the ground and how difficult it was to, you really needed a whole series of small parties concentrating on breaking up boulders into different sizes to arrange on the road. And it just wasn't feasible to have very large parties. Now, one of the big things, Bald was doing the survey. That was appointed. I'm going to give you a quick go through. This is the Bald survey in 1832. there's Larne, and you can see very clearly there's the old road there, and the new road went straight to the coast. Now, he didn't try and go around Ballygally Head. And that's about the only stretch of road up to Cushendall that he didn't go along the coast. In all, there was about, I think, 25 miles of road up to Cushendall and about 15 miles to Ballycastle. And there's about 4 miles of road, 3 to 4 miles of road that's along the coast, or that's not along the coast. All the rest of it was firmly along the coast. Now, he gives, again, one of the big selling points of the scheme really was that, first of all, I think the very fact that it was so spectacular was one of the biggest selling points to the Bodebergs themselves, because they appreciated the magnificence of the scheme, you could say. But one of the other big selling points was the fact that the old road did have very severe slopes at certain points. Now, when you look at the overall series of inclinations on the old road, quite a bit of the old road was really only gently undulating, but there were some very, very severe hills, and one of them was outside Larne. So he gives, this is one of the comparisons that Bald shows. He shows that it's kind of level, the new road is level and the old road is quite a steep road. Now, they go around Ballygally Head, and that's the stretch that's off the coast, and then back onto the coast again. And then round, this is the little deer park, and these were all unexpectedly difficult. It was probably the most difficult part of the coast road in terms of how to use gunpowder and how to destroy the rocks. And both Burgoyne and Bald had to devise a new scheme to try and deal with that in the spring of 1833. You can see here there's a kind of a fault in the rocks, and these are all in horizontal strata. There's a whole series of very fine sections showing the difficulties involved, which I'm going to show you, I'll show you later. And this comes into Glenarm, and it's back along the coast road again. This is Glenarm in 1820, and showing to you partly because it's beautiful, and then it also shows the coast road going over Cloney Point behind it. These big schemes tended to exaggerate the benefits that were going to arise out of the schemes. They tended to understate the costs, and they also tended to exaggerate the deficiencies of the communication system beforehand. Now, oh my God, what's happened to this? Good Lord.
Check your feet at the back.
Oh, good Lord. I just touched this. Okay. Please God, I won't come back. Okay, I kind of show that because you can see Glenarm there, no harbour as yet, little mill, house. It looks like a very nice place to live. Life wasn't that bad before these roads. It's an important thing to remember, because when you read these engineering reports, and this is true of Bald and all of them, they always talk as if basically the place was in utter darkness beforehand. Now, it just wasn't. Now, you're around Cloney Point. This is one of the areas where essentially in Antrim you have a limestone rock overlaid by basalt, which is a result of a volcano, and in certain parts some chalk, and then also in certain parts there's a kind of a blue clay, and in wet weather the blue clay moves and or can't resist the weight of the overlying limestone rock, and you get all kinds of subsidence problems. And this is where Bald and also Burgoyne had to deal with great subsidence problems. And they had to build revetment walls, which I'll show you later. Now, this is into Cushendall, and again it's hugging the coast the entire way, and this is where it breaks away from the coast and heads over to Carey Mountain. That's a kind of a large plan, just showing from Cushendall all the way across North Antrim coast and then down to Ballycastle. That's a kind of a closer view. It doesn't go up to Cushendun, it kind of skips there. And there was an old track from Cushendun around the head. And that's a closer view of Carey Mountain. And it shows the new road proposed and the old road. Now, here's a series of, actually I'm going to go move through this briefly. Now, when Richard Thomas got appointed, he was going to be the explosives expert. And Burgoyne, who had written about explosives, and the use of explosives in sieges and also in quarrying and in mining, had a whole series of useful bits of advice for him. One of the things he had was he had a theory that the force of explosion is the cube root of the line of the line of least resistance. Well, anyway, I can't remember it right now. But anyway, his idea was that when you're using powder, gunpowder had been used to blow up rocks and in mines and in quarries in Britain from the 1680s or so. Fuses were always used, but they were very unreliable. They tended to sort of put in a fuse and then tamp in to kind of bore a hole in a rock, put the powder down at the bottom, put in a long fuse which tended to burn irregularly, and then tamp in the hole. Now, the usual problem was that at a certain point you didn't know you couldn't really depend on the fuse. The fuse would cease to burn at a fixed rate and would just smoulder. So you could see that you just didn't know when it was going to go. And so you had to just either, you never knew when it was going to explode. And obviously that could lead to terrible accidents. The Bickford safety fuse had been invented in 1831, almost at exactly this time. And Burgoyne wasn't proficient in the use of it at that stage, but he was very attracted by the idea. The Bickford safety fuse promised a very regular combustion of the fuse, so you could predict exactly foot by foot how long it was going to take for the fuse to reach the explosive. Now, these were all kinds of little technical bits of advice that Burgoyne gave Thomas in 1831. He said that if you essentially, he advised that when you're doing rock, he kind of gives this example, but if you have that explosive there, the explosive force will go straight out the hole. And although the rock will be damaged, it won't maximise the destruction of the rock. And he advised to sort of bring the hole down using a kind of a boring tool called a jumper, create the hole and do it at angles so that it's closer to the surface, so that the distance to the surface of another part of the rock is closer than the distance to the hole where it comes in. And that, in his opinion, will maximise the explosion. He suggests too that there's a certain point where if you put in too much powder, it'll be counterproductive, because in this case, what they really wanted to do was to create large boulders initially and then to systematically use some of the large boulders and then systematically break down the other boulders. So you'd start off with one technique and then you'd use a set of other techniques in gradually breaking down the boulders. Now, this is, he kind of has all sorts of advice on, this is an interesting case because he advises against quarrymen, he says, always put in too much powder. And he details exactly how the hole should be filled. But he gives the old-fashioned method of using the powder, using a copper needle and a tamping instrument, which suggests that at least for the first 6 months to a year, they were only intermittently using the Bickford safety fuse. Now, he also suggests, and I think this was probably never used, that at times you could actually mine into the limestone, create a gallery, and set explosives. He was really thinking of his own siege engineering techniques. I doubt if that was ever used, and he gives all these kind of little sketches on how Thomas might do that. Now, one of the things, you often hear that there was quite a few deaths in the Antrim Coast Road. I spent a long time over the last few days trying to find evidence of deaths. I got evidence of maimings and injury because the Board of Works had a medical doctor at hand all the time, and there's quite a few payments to the doctor for attending patients. But I didn't come across anything relating to deaths. And initially I was thinking, well, maybe they managed to do it without deaths somehow, because they were so, with extreme care. But because I know that the Board of Works generally, if somebody died, they provided a pension to the widow. There was a kind of a compensation payment, basically, for the deaths. Then I discovered that in this case, because it was technically, the Board of Works were doing the work, but it was technically a grand jury operation, and there was no compensation for deaths. So immediately that I began to think, oh no, that means there could be deaths and it wouldn't have actually come back to the Board of Works at all. And I finally found evidence that there was deaths in this case. And this is March 1834, so it's a good year afterwards. But I'm sure, at least it's sort of proof that deaths did occur, but I've no idea how many. In reply to your letter of the 15th instance, this is a letter to William Bowl, who was the pay clerk based in Ballycastle for the duration of the works. He mentions that in cases where men die leaving families, you're to pay the widows. Under other circumstances, you're to report the facts to the board for their instructions. Now, that doesn't even suggest any kind of compensation payment. That's really just payment of wages. And it even suggests that they had reservations about payment of wages to men without families who died on the works. So I couldn't find any more on that score yet, but it's a rather gloomy sort of letter. Now, these are the sections that were on the Little Deer Park that were actually worked on. The Little Deer Park was very active for almost the entire 3 years. So it was an extremely difficult site. And you can see a whole series of these. On the map, you can see there's a list of these particular points. And these are cross sections of the point. So it's literally, you basically have the sea here, and these are different kinds of rock that have to be blown up. It's clear that there was a crisis about May 1833. Burgoyne came down to visit, and he was there for 2 weeks. And between them, Bald and Burgoyne came up with the idea of, came up with various techniques for breaking down the horizontal strata of limestone. But this is what they had to face, St. Patrick's Rock. And you can see the planned road, and you can see what had to be cut away there or blown away, and that was the road itself. And that's the dynamite, and there's the deaths. These are some 1832 images of the bridges that were designed by Bald for the road. These are for the Kerry Mountain area, and they're just very nice images of the bridge. This is Bushburn Bridge, a modern photograph by Fred Hammond, who kindly lent it to me just to show how they worked out in the end. And there's another bridge, Carriffray Bridge, and there's the Waterfoot Bridge, another Fred Hammond photograph. Now, Cloney Point, it didn't take as many men as were used in, this is the area where the main problem was less the dynamiting and the constant breaking down of complicated limestone cliffs as trying to deal with the sliding of the mud. And eventually, these are the revetment walls that Bald designed to deal with them. And they were extremely effective. Now, Kerry Mountain presented its own difficulties. You essentially had to cut a path through a very fibrous bog, and it turned out to be an extraordinarily slow process. And eventually, by the late summer of 1833, Bald felt compelled to design a kind of a special cutting tool, which was used by 2 labourers to slice through the bog fibres. That speeded up the process enormously by the early 1834. And he got them delivered. They were made by Turner and Sons in Dublin under authority of the Board of Works and delivered up to Glenarm by ship in early 1834. Those cutting tools. Now, the entire, you can kind of get a sense of, I'm kind of skipping through an awful lot of this very quickly, but you can get a sense of the number of labourers and the periods of greatest intensity from the tables that I'm giving you. Now, one of the things you kind of look at and think, somebody said, how much did this cost? The overall cost, and I kind of go into this now just as a matter of interest. This is Charles Langham, who took over in 1836 when he became county surveyor of the Antrim county surveyor. The overall cost was about £34,000. Now, if you convert that into modern, it's a difficult process converting that into modern terms because spending power changes. And the broad terms is that labour was very cheap in the Victorian period, whereas goods were very expensive by comparison with today. But the actual, if you convert it in, it's something between 2 million and 3 million pounds. So the actual road was completed at that sort of cost. And it comes down to, in modern terms, about £45,000 per mile of road. When you look at Board of Works estimates for road being done all over Ireland at the same time, the average cost in terms then was about £500 to £600 a mile. In modern terms, that would come to about £30,000 a mile. So in fact, it was extraordinarily cheap, but it's deceptive, and it's essentially because the effort, most of what was going into it was simply human labour with gunpowder and then engineering expertise. There was very little technology other than the kind of mauls and picks and wedges that were being used all the time. So it was highly labour intensive and labour was extraordinarily cheap. And that's actually an interesting kind of fact. Now when Langham took over, basically he didn't finish, the entire thing was finished between, he finished off the in-between bits of the Antrim Coast Road between late 1836 and 1841-42. The Glendon Viaduct, Bald had designed a viaduct, but Langham had quite a considerable input into the design later on. This is an interesting this is the earliest picture of the Antrim Coast Road that I could come across, and it's from Hull's, Ireland, in 1843. And I can only guess this is Turley's Cut, which was incorporated into the Antrim Coast Road. It doesn't look particularly impressive, but I suspect that there's artistic license there. One of the interesting things that the Halls mention is that as the limestone was full of flint, and as the boulders were being blown up, the children used to collect the flints, and the flints were sent off for glass production to England. So I shudder to think, trying to manage kind of explosive work with lots of children around waiting for flints. It sounds a horrible problem. But okay, these are the earliest photographs of the Antrim Coast Road. And you can see this is about 1870. And it's Black Cave outside Larne. And you can see it's very neat. It's not particularly wide. And it's typically a tourist car. Garran Point with unstable cliffs there. Well, I think like Glenarm, should I say, and I think this is Garran Point. So you can see really what we've got today. This is now, you'd have to say, all the images that you see, there was very little traffic that took it. So probably if you look at it with kind of cold objectivity, you'd have to say, well, it was a vast sum of money, or a vast expenditure of human labour, and it didn't really produce a vast amount of commercial traffic. It was kind of a magnificent engineering feat, and it points up to me something about Bold and something about engineering at the time. In a way, there was a kind of a strong artistic streak to an awful lot of these projects. They were almost done for their own sake, and you could never wish it undone. It was an extraordinary piece of artistry, and this was true of a great deal of Ball's work in particular. Now, this is a little where Ball himself moved on to other projects after 1835, and he wasn't involved in the Antrim Coast Road at all. He did quite a bit of work in railways and in harbours, in reclamation projects, and bridges in the later 1830s. This was he was asked by the Earl of Antrim to devise a scheme for Glenarm Harbour, and this was what he produced. But there was nothing produced for Glenarm Harbour until the 1860s, unfortunately. This was probably the last major piece of beautiful work that was produced, and it's the Kinnair suspension bridge. Again, artistry is heavily there, really, and it's one of the ways that people were convinced to produce these things. Lansdowne, the Marquis of Lansdowne down in Kenmare funded half of this bridge and was particularly admired and sponsored Ball's proposal of a suspension bridge, although many other engineers suggested standard bridges for the Sound. But the suspension bridge went ahead, and it really was a work of art in itself. He himself, Bald, wanted suspension bridges used all over the British Isles. After that, he was a big advocate of suspension bridges. Now, I kind of showed you that shell at the very beginning, and I was led to think of the shell because you tend to think of engineers as highly rational creatures, and of course, if you're a Freudian, you often suspect that the more rational a creature is, the stronger the emotional drive, the unconscious emotional drive. So it's not, everything isn't as it seems. But one of the things I noticed about Bald was his creative passion. He did have immense artistic appreciation. And there were several throwaway remarks that kind of led me to see this. This is a harbour designed for Ladies' Cove on Tramore Bay in Waterford in 1839. And if you look at this, he actually designed that around shells and shellfish, in particular the piddock that I showed you. And he basically had the almost mystical belief that the creatures of the sea, the engineering of the creatures of the sea, should be examined and pondered to use by engineers, because they could deal, because anything along the same lines would work best in marine construction. And it's a contemplative idea as much as an engineering idea. So you can see the resemblance between the piddock and the kind of seawall structure that he used. Now that's a kind of a conceit, you could say. But now Bald himself, his first wife died in 1820, and he married again 3 years later to the daughter of Richard Barrett, who was a United Irishman who had been executed after the rebellion in 1799. And he actually later became quite nationalist. In the 1840s, he has quite a few critical. He lets go with quite a few critical remarks about the administration of Ireland by English government over previous centuries. He becomes Catholic as well. He was originally Presbyterian, and he becomes Catholic. He moves to Glasgow, where he worked for the Glasgow Corporation for about 5 years until the relationship broke down in 1845. And then he moved down to London, and he was a consultant engineer in France for the Corporation of Rouen. and for the city of Paris. He tended to kind of work on the River Seine for most of that period. He came back he spent some years there, lengthy periods for some years, but he came back as a very eminent engineer to London in the 1850s and worked on a consultancy role for the British Parliament throughout the 1850s. He died in 1858, I think it is, in 1857, in March 1857. And unlike most engineers at the time, engineers were very, very well paid. I mean, they were really among the commercial elite at the time. And he would have been quite well paid throughout his life. But he left only about £300 or £400, which he distributed among his children. He married 3 times. His second 2 wives were both from County Mayo. And he had about 13 children in all, and he left each of them £50 when he died. He died at the age of 68, which is comparatively young, of abscess of the lungs. We still don't have a portrait of him, and I like to think of him as an amazingly gifted outsider in the engineering world at the time. This only gives you a sense of the amount of material that needs to be assembled into a coherent picture. But I hope it kind of gives you an idea of a fresh idea of the Antrim Coast Road so far. So that's as far as I'll go. Thank you.